The alien nurse floated into the medical bay, her movements precise and controlled, her multiple appendages adjusting the various scanning instruments with mechanical perfection. Everything in the room gleamed with sterile efficiency, panels of light dancing across the walls, holographic displays projecting vital stats and schematics of alien physiology. She prided herself on professionalism. The art of medicine was not about whimsy or distraction, but precision and discipline. She had treated countless species from across the galaxy, winged Sarikans, tentacled Blorans, and even the six-legged Grotari, but humans were always supposed to be simple. Standard anatomy, uncomplicated biology, predictable parameters. Routine checkups were supposed to be exactly that, routine. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, and in strolled the human. The human moved differently from the alien patients she had treated, upright, casual, and unnervingly confident. He didn't fumble with his medical gown or hiss with nervous anticipation. He just walked in, bare-chested, with the kind of relaxed self-assurance that immediately sent a ripple of confusion through her carefully organized sensors. Her scanners, perfectly calibrated for human physiology on paper, began emitting faint alarms. Small lights blinked erratically, and the air felt suddenly charged. She froze for a moment, one of her appendages hovering over a panel, then blinked rapidly to clear the unexpected interference. Standard human anatomy, she murmured to herself, repeating the mantra she had drilled into her memory. Everything should have been normal. Normal, predictable, safe. And yet the readings were anything but normal. Her holographic monitor flickered as it tried to display the relevant metrics, zooming in and out as though the system itself couldn't process the size of what it was sensing. Her hands, usually so steady, fumbled slightly as she tapped the touch panels to recalibrate the scanners. Beeps and blips echoed through the room, rising in pitch, almost like the technology was protesting against reality. The human noticed, of course. He tilted his head, cocked an eyebrow, and smiled in a way that was charming and oblivious all at once. "Everything okay?" he asked, voice smooth, unshaken, entirely unaware that the room's sensors were effectively screaming. His confidence was maddeningly serene, the kind that suggested he had no concept that what he carried naturally could trigger a minor medical alert. He leaned slightly forward, an unconscious movement that made her sensors flare again, and she felt a strange combination of professional duty and flustered curiosity that she had never experienced before. Trying to regain control, she adjusted her posture, straightening her back and smoothing down her uniform-like attire, though she knew it did little to hide the rapid oscillations of her visual sensors and the subtle tremble of her appendages. I will proceed with a standard checkup," she said, her voice precise but with an unusual tremor. Her appendages hovered over the controls, ready to activate whatever tool might be necessary, though she wasn't entirely sure which one anymore. The human's presence was throwing everything off balance. Her training emphasized composure in all scenarios, yet she couldn't stop the unexpected rush of data and emotion the human provoked. The human, entirely unfazed, removed the last layer of clothing without ceremony. The nurse's sensors flickered wildly, alarms chiming softly in a syncopated rhythm that seemed to mock her internal struggle. She blinked rapidly, attempting to force her processors to focus on the medical task, on measurements, on scanning, anything that could restore a semblance of control. But the sheer size of what the system was trying to quantify created cascading errors in every readout. Light panels flashed, holographic projections stretched absurdly, and even the normally inanimate instruments seemed to vibrate in anticipation. One of her appendages fumbled a scanner, which clattered onto the floor with a loud metallic echo. Another attempted to stabilize a floating display, only to have it jerk violently to one side, spilling holographic charts across the room like a burst of chaotic starlight. She clamped down on herself, muttering in her native tongue, which translated loosely as, "This is unprecedented. This cannot be accurate." Yet the human only smiled, tilting his head as if amused by the chaos that he had somehow unknowingly caused. His casual demeanor only deepened the alien nurse's flustered state. Trying to maintain professionalism, she adjusted her gloves, straightened her instruments, and tried to take a deep, controlled breath. It was useless. Every time she dared to glance at him, her systems alarmed again. Her internal logic argued for detachment, for the cold precision she prided herself on, but curiosity had begun to override discipline. She had been taught to compartmentalize, to maintain the clinical distance that every professional nurse of the Galactic Federation was expected to uphold. Yet here, faced with something so unprecedented and biologically remarkable, even her training faltered. The human leaned slightly forward, gesturing with casual ease as if to reassure her. "You seem tense," he said with a grin, entirely oblivious to the fact that his anatomy had just sent her life support and sensor arrays into minor chaos. She flailed internally, unsure whether to treat this as a biological anomaly or a social interaction that required immediate professional tact. Her appendages trembled, hovering over calibration dials, while her holographic interface struggled to interpret the readings. In a desperate attempt to regain control, she activated the primary scanner, fingers flying over controls with more energy than usual. The scanner whirred and hummed, lights flickering faster than they should, before projecting a full three-dimensional readout. The image expanded, zoomed, and hovered in midair like a defiant holographic monument to human biology. Her sensors beeped frantically, lights flashed red and yellow, and her entire body recoiled slightly from the overwhelming data. And then it happened, she dropped the scanner entirely. It clanged loudly against the floor, bouncing once before coming to rest at her feet. For a moment, there was silence. Even the human seemed caught off guard, his charming grin faltering as he realized she was no longer maintaining strict composure. She straightened abruptly, her sensors still sputtering, and waved one appendage vaguely toward the floating displays. "Extra precautions necessary," she stammered, the words escaping more as an instinctive plea than professional instruction. The human laughed, a deep, unaware sound that only made her blush, or the closest approximation of a blush that her species could exhibit. He leaned casually against the counter, watching her flustered attempts to regain control, entirely amused and intrigued. The nurse's internal systems were running emergency protocols, maintain decorum, manage data, control personal reactions, but none of it worked. She realized, in that instant, that the human's presence, combined with his anatomy, had thrown her into a state of chaotic fascination, blending professional shock, awkward curiosity, and a completely unexpected spark of interest she would never admit aloud. Her appendages trembled slightly as she attempted to regain composure, but the chaos of floating instruments, blinking scanners, and the human's relaxed confidence left her utterly unprepared. For the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if she was more concerned with the biology, the safety, or the inexplicable curiosity, and perhaps something else entirely. Something that fluttered in her chest at the mere proximity of him, masked behind the alarms and blinking lights, hidden beneath the chaos of her professional facade. The human tilted his head again, smiling innocently, and said, "Ready when you are." His casual confidence, combined with the monumental size that had triggered her internal alerts, left the alien nurse both horrified and fascinated. She nodded, her voice a strained whisper. "Yes, yes, we shall proceed." All while knowing that this would not be a routine checkup. Not today. Not ever. The room seemed to hum with the tension of professional duty, chaotic machinery, and a deeply flustered curiosity that neither of them fully understood, setting the stage for the absurd, awkward, and hilariously intimate chaos that was about to unfold. The alien nurse took a deep, controlled breath, attempting to recalibrate her sensors and stabilize the flaring alarms, but the human's relaxed presence seemed to conspire against her efforts. Every time she adjusted a scanner or tweaked a holographic projection, the readings jumped wildly, blinking red, yellow, and green in a riot of chaotic color. Her appendages fluttered nervously over the controls, some gripping charts, others hovering over floating instruments, while the human stood calmly, seemingly unconcerned by the technological uproar he had caused. His casual confidence contrasted sharply with the cascading chaos, making her fluster spike in ways she hadn't anticipated. She moved forward, slowly, to initiate a physical scan, intending to measure vital signs and muscle density, but the moment her instruments neared him, they sprang to life in unexpected ways. One of the scanning beams split into multiple projections, bouncing across the room and forming floating holograms of his anatomy that defied gravity, size, and reason. The nurse's appendages froze mid-motion, twitching as if unsure which function to prioritize, and a soft alarm beeped insistently as the holographic images rotated, expanded, and even seemed to shimmer as if mocking her professionalism. She swallowed audibly, though the human could not hear it over the soft hum of the machinery. The human leaned slightly forward, curiosity sparkling in his posture. "Is this normal?" he asked, eyes scanning the floating diagrams with an innocent sort of intrigue. His grin was casual, teasing, unaware that the scanner had now officially declared a Level 9 alert, a reading typically reserved for enormous bioanomalies. The nurse's heart, or the nearest equivalent in her alien physiology, skipped a beat, her appendages jerking in reflexive panic as she tried to regain control. One of her tools slipped from her grip and hovered midair, spinning like a confused satellite before bumping gently into a wall panel. "Oh, it's fine," she stammered, forcing her voice into a calm, clipped tone that sounded nothing like her internal state. "Completely standard procedure. Please remain still while I adjust the parameters." She reached for a stabilizer, only to knock over a small tray of instruments. They clattered across the floor, bouncing off walls and pinging against floating containment shields, producing a chorus of metallic notes that would have sounded comical under any other circumstance. The human's laughter echoed lightly through the bay, a rich, warm sound that made her sensors tingle with something she could not quite classify. He stepped closer, tilting his head in that infuriatingly charming way, completely oblivious to the chaos he had caused. "You seem tense," he said softly, voice smooth, calm, playful even. The words were innocent, but combined with the magnitude of what he carried and her own flustered state, they ignited a mix of alarm, curiosity, and something dangerously close to fascination in her. She recoiled slightly, her appendages instinctively moving to protect herself from a non-existent threat, though her eyes, or their nearest analog, could not stop tracking him. Determined to maintain professionalism, she activated the secondary scanner, one that projected a holographic grid of vital signs and molecular composition. The device whirred and pulsed, but within seconds the system emitted a soft, urgent chime, accompanied by a projection that expanded and rotated uncontrollably. The holographic display now seemed to exaggerate every contour, every line, every dimension in a way that was both scientifically impossible and undeniably comedic. She froze, gripping the edge of a console for balance, while the human's eyes sparkled with amusement. "I think we might need a bigger scanner," she muttered under her breath, a mix of professional concern and personal mortification. Her fingers flew over touch panels, trying to recalibrate, but every attempt seemed to provoke further chaos. Instruments levitated, charts spun midair, and soft alarms chimed in a frantic symphony. The human leaned casually on a counter, arms crossed, watching her fluster with an amused, innocent fascination that only made her blush, or whatever approximated a blush in her species. As she adjusted a floating spectrometer, it suddenly emitted a bright beam that reflected off the holographic projections, creating a cascade of shimmering light that bounced across the walls. One of her appendages reached out instinctively to stabilize the instrument, but instead, it knocked another tray, sending small devices spinning into the air. The human reached to help, brushing lightly against her arm while catching a floating sensor mid-flight. The sudden contact caused her to recoil, flustered, even as her sensors registered an inexplicable spike in interest. "Maybe less direct contact?" she said, voice slightly shaking, though her appendages trembled more violently. The human only laughed softly, misinterpreting her awkwardness as playful banter. "Relax, I'm not going to explode," he teased, though the holographic scanners continued to beep as if daring him to say so. The nurse gritted her teeth, forcing herself to focus on the data, on the procedure, on anything but the overwhelming combination of his anatomy and his infuriating charm. Her mind raced, stay professional, maintain decorum, complete the examination. Yet every step brought new chaos. Sensors misfired, instruments floated unpredictably, and the holograms expanded to ridiculous proportions. She attempted to stabilize a levitating panel, only to send it spinning past the human, who caught it with a casual flick of his wrist. She froze again, torn between irritation, embarrassment, and an unfamiliar, fluttering curiosity. Finally, with a determined push of her appendages and careful recalibration, she managed to stabilize the room somewhat, the holograms shrinking to tolerable levels, instruments settling into orderly positions. She exhaled slowly, attempting to collect herself, though her sensors still flickered sporadically, betraying her internal state. The human stepped closer, leaning slightly forward with that easy grin, oblivious to the chaos he had inspired, and said, "Feeling better now?" She blinked rapidly, trying to force a neutral, professional response, but her words caught in her throat. "Yes, more manageable," she muttered, unable to resist the subtle pull of his charm. His confidence, his calm demeanor, his sheer, unassuming size had undone her perfectly maintained composure, leaving a mix of panic, fascination, and something else entirely. The room was quiet for a moment, the machinery humming softly, instruments floating gently, and holographic charts now stable. And yet, the tension lingered, awkward, charged, and undeniably electric. She knew this was far from over. Every glance at him, every inadvertent touch of hovering instruments, every soft sound of laughter or alarm continued to stoke a strange, flustered curiosity she had no experience handling. And the human, entirely unaware of the inner storm he had unleashed, smiled again, as calm and confident as if nothing unusual had occurred. For the alien nurse, the examination had begun as routine. By now, it had evolved into a chaotic, comedic, and strangely intimate experience, blending professional duty with flustered fascination in ways she could not have anticipated. She adjusted her appendages, readying herself for the next step, fully aware that the combination of his anatomy, his charm, and her own reactions was only going to escalate from here. The alien nurse wiped her hovering appendages across a floating console, trying desperately to regain control over the chaotic medical bay, but every attempt seemed to trigger a new wave of alarms. The holographic scanner, still projecting exaggerated three-dimensional anatomy, pulsed in sync with her racing internal systems. She adjusted the controls, hoping to stabilize the images, yet the moment her appendages moved closer to the human, the display flickered violently, projecting enlarged, rotating versions of his anatomy across the room. Instruments floated erratically, bouncing gently off containment shields, and even the soft hum of the lights seemed to pulse with comedic urgency. The human, standing innocently in the middle of the room, tilted his head and grinned, clearly entertained by the spectacle. "I think the scanners are exaggerating again," she muttered under her breath, fingers flying across touch panels in a flurry of desperation. She attempted to focus on the vital signs instead, but every sensor beeped insistently, flagging an anomaly that wasn't entirely false. Her internal processors struggled to maintain composure, while the human's relaxed posture seemed to taunt her flustered state. She tried to take a deep, controlled breath, but one of her appendages knocked over a tray of floating instruments, sending them spinning in all directions. The human reached instinctively to catch one, brushing her arm in the process. She recoiled instantly, her sensors flickering in chaotic patterns. "Careful!" she exclaimed, her voice betraying the fluster she usually hid so well. The human only laughed, leaning back casually, entirely oblivious to the tension he was generating. "I'm fine," he said lightly, catching another spinning instrument mid-air with effortless grace. Each casual gesture of his seemed to exacerbate her reactions, and she could feel herself teetering on the edge of losing all professional composure. Her appendages hovered uncertainly, some clinging to the console for stability, others twitching toward floating instruments as if unsure whether to assist or retreat. Determined to maintain some semblance of authority, she activated the secondary containment protocol, a series of holographic shields meant to control errant objects and stabilize the room. Yet as soon as the shields extended, they bounced off the floating instruments, redirecting them into new, unpredictable trajectories. A small scanning probe ricocheted off one of the shields, narrowly missing the human, who caught it midair without breaking his smile. She could feel her circuits overheating in response, a chaotic mix of professional panic and an unfamiliar, fluttering curiosity she had never experienced with any other species. The human leaned forward slightly, eyes sparkling with playful mischief. "You know," he said, voice smooth and teasing, "you're way too tense for someone who's supposed to be a professional." She flinched at the proximity, her appendages jerking reflexively as she tried to maintain distance while simultaneously stabilizing a floating instrument. Her inner dialogue raced: stay professional, maintain composure, focus on the examination, but her systems were betraying her, sending signals that conflicted with logic. As she attempted to recalibrate the holographic display, one of her appendages brushed against the human's arm, an accident, purely technical, but the reaction it triggered in both of them was undeniable. The human's grin widened slightly, interpreting her fluster as playful, while she retracted hastily, sensors oscillating in a nervous rhythm. Her attempts to regain control were repeatedly interrupted by minor mishaps: a floating chart spinning out of reach, a hologram suddenly enlarging, a scanner beeping with urgent insistence. Each incident escalated the absurdity, and the human's amusement only fueled her embarrassment. In a desperate move, she activated a manual override to stabilize the instruments. The holographic images shrank, instruments floated obediently back into place, and the ambient alarms quieted, leaving the room humming softly with residual energy. For a moment she allowed herself a shaky exhale, feeling slightly victorious, but then the human stepped closer, tilting his head with that infuriating mix of charm and curiosity. He extended a hand, casually touching one of the floating holograms to inspect it, and the nurse's sensors flared again, signaling an unexpected spike in interest. "You're very thorough," he said lightly, eyes scanning the stabilized projections. She blinked rapidly, trying to process the layered meanings: scientific observation, teasing, and something undeniably flirtatious. She attempted to maintain neutrality, adjusting her appendages to correct minor misalignments in the instruments, yet the subtle brush of his hand against hers, or even near her hovering appendages, kept sending her systems into minor overdrive. Her mind raced: professionalism, procedure, decorum, all jostled alongside a strange fascination she hadn't anticipated. Each glance at him, each small accidental gesture, seemed magnified in importance. She tried to resume the examination, instructing him to remain still while she conducted measurements, but every step was punctuated by comedic mishaps: floating sensors bumping into walls, holographic charts spinning uncontrollably, instruments pinging off containment shields. The human dodged none of it. Instead, he seemed to enjoy the absurd ballet of chaos, moving lightly and reacting with playful curiosity. Finally, she stabilized the room sufficiently to proceed with actual measurements. She hovered over the scanner, tentatively adjusting the projections while attempting to ignore the flustered reactions her own internal systems continued to broadcast. The human, unaware of the emotional tempest he had caused, leaned casually against the counter, arms crossed, watching her with an amused and innocent expression. "You know," he said softly, voice teasing, "I think you secretly like this." The nurse froze, appendages trembling, holographic instruments wobbling in sympathy. She opened her mouth to correct him, to assert professionalism, but the words caught in her throat. Her system diagnostics indicated elevated stress signals, unusual curiosity spikes, and a rapidly increasing fascination parameter, all triggered by the human's proximity, his relaxed confidence, and the sheer absurdity of his anatomy. She adjusted a floating scanner frantically, trying to restore order, yet every correction seemed to create new minor chaos: bouncing instruments, flickering holograms, and a soft chorus of alarms. And in that moment, she realized that the examination had evolved from a routine procedure into something entirely unpredictable: a comedic ballet of chaos, flustered curiosity, and unspoken tension. Every flinch, every accidental touch, every hovering instrument seemed to carry a subtle undercurrent of intimacy, and she couldn't deny it, even if her professional instincts screamed to maintain decorum. The human's oblivious confidence and casual charm had turned her orderly bay into a stage for slapstick, accidental flirtation, and chaotic fascination, and she was simultaneously horrified and captivated. By the time the secondary stabilizers brought the instruments and holograms under partial control, she allowed herself a brief pause, adjusting her appendages carefully. The human's grin remained easy, unbothered, and entirely charming. For the alien nurse, this was no longer just a medical examination, it was an escalating dance of comedic disasters, flustered reactions, and the strange, fluttering beginnings of something neither science nor protocol could fully explain. The alien nurse took a trembling breath, trying to steady her appendages as the holographic instruments and floating charts finally settled into an uneasy calm. The soft hum of the medical bay replaced the earlier cacophony of alarms, and for a fleeting moment, everything seemed manageable. She straightened herself, carefully adjusting a floating scanner with precise movements, yet her sensors continued to flicker intermittently, betraying the lingering fluster that refused to dissipate. Across the room, the human watched her with that same calm, confident grin, entirely at ease in the eye of the storm he had inadvertently created. She forced herself to focus on the task at hand, scanning his vital signs and muscle readings with a careful, professional detachment. Yet every glance at him made her sensors flare in ways that had nothing to do with medical data. She adjusted her appendages with exaggerated care, trying to appear fully in control while internally recalculating the multitude of emotions and curiosities the human had provoked. Every accidental brush of a hand, every slight shift in his stance, sent her systems into minor overdrive, making her feel both embarrassed and captivated. "I think everything is stable now," she said, her voice still clipped with a hint of tension, though her internal systems were anything but calm. She hovered near a console, fingers, if one could call her multi-jointed appendages fingers, darting over controls to ensure that the floating instruments and holograms remained stationary. The human, noticing her struggle, leaned casually against the counter, one arm propped lazily, eyes scanning her movements with playful curiosity. "You did a great job," he said lightly, voice warm and teasing. "I'm impressed." Her sensors stuttered at the unexpected praise, and she could feel herself heating with an alien equivalent of embarrassment. She fumbled briefly with a holographic stabilizer, causing a small projection to wobble awkwardly, and she muttered under her breath, "Professionalism, maintain composure." But even as she chastised herself internally, she could not deny the subtle thrill coursing through her circuits at the human's relaxed attention. He was unassuming yet magnetic, confident yet completely oblivious to the chaos his presence had created. In a brief lull, she allowed herself a moment to observe him more closely. Every detail, the casual tilt of his head, the slight flex of his muscles, the mischievous glint in his eyes, seemed amplified by the fluster that coursed through her systems. She adjusted a hovering instrument with one appendage while the other brushed against a nearby console, her gestures betraying both precision and nervous tension. The human noticed the careful movements, a small grin spreading across his face as he leaned slightly closer, apparently intrigued by her careful focus. "Relax," he said softly, voice low and teasing yet gentle. "I'm not dangerous. Really." His words, meant to reassure, triggered an almost immediate spike in her internal readings. She froze, her appendages suspended midair, blinking rapidly as if to reset her systems. She could feel the tension vibrating in the room, a mix of professional anxiety and a burgeoning curiosity she had never experienced with any other species. The subtle touch of his proximity, the playful undertone in his voice, and the lingering memory of chaotic holograms combined to create a sensation she could neither analyze nor suppress. Determined to regain composure, she activated a final stabilizer to ensure that no instruments would drift unexpectedly. The floating charts and scanners gently realigned themselves, settling into a calm, orderly state that reflected the quiet of the room. She exhaled slowly, appendages relaxing for the first time in what felt like an eternity, though the rapid flicker of her sensors indicated that her internal systems were still racing. The human stepped closer, not aggressively, but casually, and extended a hand to indicate the now stable instruments, his touch light and unassuming. Her sensors reacted immediately, sending subtle warning pulses that she attempted to suppress. She raised one appendage instinctively, not in defense, but to guide a floating tool closer, her gestures betraying a mixture of professionalism and lingering fluster. The human's gaze followed each movement, his grin never fading, amused by the delicate dance of caution and curiosity. "You're incredible at what you do," he said softly. "Even when things get complicated." His words carried both sincere admiration and a subtle undertone of playfulness, further heightening the tension in the room. For a moment, the nurse allowed herself to simply exist in that space, sensors still tingling, appendages hovering lightly, and holographic instruments projecting calm patterns across the bay. She realized that this encounter had shifted from a routine examination into something entirely different, a mixture of comedy, chaos, fascination, and an intimate curiosity that she could not ignore. Every misfired sensor, every hovering instrument, every accidental brush had been part of a delicate dance, and she found herself both horrified and captivated by it all. Finally, she allowed herself a small gesture of relaxation, letting one appendage hover gently near the human without recoiling. The human noticed, stepping just slightly closer, and the proximity, though subtle, sent a fresh pulse of fluster through her system. "I think we make a good team," he said lightly, eyes sparkling, teasing yet warm. She blinked rapidly, internal diagnostics screaming caution, yet a part of her, an unfamiliar, curious part, acknowledged the truth in his words. As the hum of the bay returned to a steady rhythm and the hologram stabilized fully, there was a quiet, unspoken connection in the air. The nurse, professional yet undeniably flustered, adjusted a final instrument, allowing herself a tiny, controlled exhale. The human, still relaxed and entirely charming, mirrored the subtle movements with ease, creating a rhythm that was as much comedic as it was intimate. They stood there, a moment suspended between chaos and calm, professionalism and curiosity, comedy and a budding, awkwardly expressed romantic tension. A small chime echoed softly from a hovering scanner, reminding them both of the ever-present absurdity of the situation. The nurse gave a faint, almost imperceptible sigh and allowed herself a minuscule smile, sensing that though the examination was technically over, the story, both chaotic and flirtatiously intimate, was far from finished. The human's playful gaze, the lingering tension in her sensors, and the silent comedy of floating instruments hinted at further adventures, awkward mishaps, and moments of flustered connection that neither of them would soon forget. For the alien nurse, it had been a routine checkup that had spiraled into chaos, comedy, and unexpected fascination. And as she hovered there, adjusting the final instrument and glancing at the human's calm, amused expression, she realized that some encounters were never meant to be simple, never meant to be strictly professional. They were meant to provoke curiosity, laughter, and a strange, undeniable spark that no protocol or training could ever contain.